Hi, I'm Darby Santiago, and today I'm going to talk about how you can compute for the minimum passing level of your examinations. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to differentiate the norm and criterion reference systems of determining the passing mark. 2. Choose the appropriate method of computing for the minimum passing level for various types of examinations. And 3. Compute for your examinations MPL using the norm reference system, the Nedelsky, Angoff, and Ebel methods. Okay, let's begin. There are two types of systems of determining the passing mark, the norm reference and the criterion reference. The norm reference is a system of interpreting scores based on how well an examinee performs in relation to the performance of others who took the same test. The rationale for this is that the achievements of other students exposed to similar conditions should be the reference for evaluating student performance. The criterion reference interprets scores based on how well an examinee performs in relation to a predetermined standard. The rationale for this is that if knowledge and skills are clearly defined in the objectives, then the minimum level of performance needed to attain each grade level can be determined by some fair and logical method. The norm reference system of computing for the MPL is quite easy. It's straightforward. So after you administer the test, you score all your papers, and then you gather all the scores, get the frequency distribution, the mean, and the standard deviation, and then you set the MPL by choosing a point below the mean. Usually, if the teacher is lenient, he sets this at 0.5 or 1 standard deviation below the mean, and that's it. Now, the more complex ones, the criterion reference system. These are not perfect methods. There are criticisms about these methods, but let's just discuss them as they are presented. But more important, in all these three methods, the examiners must put themselves in the shoes of a barely passing student or the minimally competent student before making your supposed MPL. Now, that is the most difficult step to do. Now, how will you define the minimally competent student? This is the definition. He has a good fund of information, can define terms, recall factual information and key findings, and make simple connections to previous and concurrent material. He is familiar with common diseases and conditions, and he can answer questions based on uncomplicated or common clinical vignettes to do the following: formulate a differential diagnosis, identify the most likely diagnosis, outline the mechanism of the disease, make clinical correlations, and determine subsequent actions to be taken, such as what is the next test, management, and treatment options. A minimally competent student will have difficulty in following complex problems with large amount of data. They will have difficulty recognizing rare conditions or complicated presentations of common diseases, comparing and contrasting similar disease states, answering questions based on complex and uncommon clinical vignettes, connecting and integrating concepts, explaining the meaning of findings, how they relate to each other, and how they manifest clinically. And finally, he will have difficulty in interpreting lab tests or explaining when it would be appropriate to obtain certain lab tests. This is not a hard and fast rule, but you may define your own minimally competent student. Now let's move on to the three methods of computing for the passing mark. First, we will discuss the Nedelsky method. The Nedelsky method can only be utilized for multiple choice questions. So for each item, you will determine which option a borderline student can reject outright as wrong. So you choose as many, 1, 2, or 3. And then you determine the acceptability index of the item, which is computed as 1 over the number of items not rejected. You then compute for the MPL of the entire test by summing up all the AI for all the items and divide this by the total number of questions, and finally multiplying by 100 to get a percentage. So for example, what is the acceptability index of an MCQ with 4 choices where only one answer can be easily rejected by a minimally competent student? So the AI is 1 over the number of items not rejected. And that is, you can only eliminate 1, so we have 3 left. And the AI will be 0.033. What if the student can only rule out two choices? So the AI will be 1 over 2, which is the number of items not rejected, or this will be equal to 0.5. If the student can eliminate 3 items, then the score should be 1. And then you add all of these again, all the AI for all the numbers, and divide by the total number of questions, multiplied by 100. And that's the Nedelsky method. Now let's go to the Angoff method. There are 2 types there are 2 ways how you can use the first method. The item should be ranked based on the likelihood that the minimally competent student will answer the item correctly. A rank of 1.0 indicates that the student is likely to correctly answer the question. A rank of 0.5 indicates that the student has a 50-50 chance of correctly answering the question. And a rank of 0 indicates that this minimally competent student is not likely to be able to answer the question. And then you average. There will be a number of faculty members doing this same ranking for each item. So what you do is you collate the ranking of each faculty member, get the average, and that will constitute the MPL of the exam item. And you usually lock this item for the entirety of the school year, this MPL. In the second method, you assess the question individually and determine the percentage of questions of similar difficulty as the item being analyzed that can be answered by a borderline student. Or another method is determine what percentage of about 100 borderline students will be able to answer the item correctly. For example, you think for item 1, about 60 students will be able to answer. Your MPL would be 0.6. And to compute for the total MPL, it's the same, no? Gather all the MPL for all the numbers, the items, and divide this by the number of items multiplied by 100. That's your Angoff method. Lastly, the Ebel method. In the Ebel method, you have to categorize your questions according to relevance and difficulty levels. In the relevance can be categorize them as essential, important, acceptable, or questionable. An alternative type of category for relevance is must know, useful to know, and nice to know. In the first, you have 4 choices. In the second, it's much simpler. You just have 3. So it's up to you what you want to choose. Now we'll go to the difficulty level. It's usually easy, medium, and hard. Simple. After which, you assign scores or percentage for the questions. For example, if the question is easy and essential, 100% of the students should be able to get this. And accordingly, you label all the others. For example, an easy question that is important, you score this as 90, and an easy question, which is, quite acceptable, just give it an 80% chance. And easy questionable, just give 70%. You can put the other MPL for each item accordingly. So you set this before you continue on to the next step. The next step is to create a table similar to this one. If you look at the first column, I've put it displays there the essential, important, acceptable, and questionable. And under those are the subheadings of easy, medium, and hard. No? And then the second column is the number of items. For example, we have 500 item question examination. And then on the third column, you have the MPL for each group, such as what we have talked about earlier. Okay. And then the next thing that you do is to look at all your questions and classify each and every question. Okay. So in this case, they found that there are 94 essential questions. There are about 106 easy but important questions, and so on and so forth. What you do is you just multiply to get the values for the last column. So there, you can see in the last column the product of columns 2 and 3. And at the very bottom, you will see this number, 337,130. That's the total of the column 4. The next is you take the two totals and compute for the final MPL. It's just that easy. So 37,130 divided by 500 items is equal to 74.26 or 74%. That's your MPL. This is another format that you can use wherein in the first table they cross the reference, no? The essential, important, acceptable, the columns, and the rows are in the difficulty, the easy, medium, and hard. And the next table is the number of items allocated for each group. Okay. What is important to note is that the table can be made into 3 by 3 because their relevance classification is just 3. No? Must know, know, and nice to know. And you can actually fill out all the boxes. Unlike in the first example, some of the boxes were not filled out. Easy and essential questions need not be given an MPL of 100% all the time. So it's really up to you on what to put for as your MPL for the type of question. Okay, overall, the criterion reference system is widely used in schools today. The advantages are that the achievement is related to the level of competency or degree of mastery of the course objectives and the test abilities which students must demonstrate at mastery level. And it's used for small and homogeneous groups. The disadvantages are that it's difficult to set reasonable standards. And it is not valid for exams which are less than 30 items. There is no allowances for individual differences and requires high validity and reliability. And lastly, it has a potential for a high failure rate on the part of the student. So in summary, we've discussed two systems of determining the passing mark, the norm reference and the criterion reference system. Okay, then in the norm reference system, you just get the mean of all the scores, and then you set the passing mark at 0.5 to 1 standard deviation below the mean. In the criterion reference system, you have to put yourself in the position of a minimally competent student, and there are 3 types. No? You use the Nedelsky, the Angoff, and the in the Nedelsky method, this is just for multiple choice questions. You count how many items the student can easily reject as an answer, and then compute for the AI, and finally the summation of the M. In the Angoff method, you just get the item MPL by putting yourself and getting the person and thinking how much percentage of 100 borderline students would be able to get the answer correctly. You just sum up this individual item MPL, and then you get the MPL for the exam. And lastly, the one we've discussed is the Ebel, wherein you have to categorize your questions as to their relevance and difficulty level. Thank you for listening. I hope you've learned something today, and these are my references.